Artemis II came home on a prayer and a flawed heat shield. On the evening of April 10, 2026, 4 human beings fell through the atmosphere at nearly 25,000 miles per hour, surrounded by plasma hot enough to melt steel, with no way to talk to anyone on the ground, protected by a heat shield that NASA already knew was broken. Not broken in theory, broken in practice. Tested once before on an uncrewed flight, and it came back with chunks missing. Over 100 locations where the material had cracked, fractured, and blown off in fragments instead of melting away the way it was designed to. And NASA strapped 4 people to it anyway: Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen. 3 Americans and a Canadian sealed inside a capsule called Integrity, about to find out if that name was earned or ironic. To understand why those minutes above the Pacific Ocean were the most dangerous any astronaut has faced in decades, you need to understand what went wrong 3.5 years earlier on a flight that had no crew aboard to worry about. In December 2022, NASA launched Artemis I. No astronauts, just the Orion spacecraft on a test run around the Moon and back. The flight itself went well. Orion circled the Moon, took beautiful photographs, and came screaming back toward Earth the way it was supposed to. The re-entry looked clean. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific off the coast of Baja California, and teams fished it out of the water. Mission accomplished. Then they flipped it over and looked at the bottom. The heat shield, a 16.5-foot wide disc made of a material called Avcoat, was supposed to have charred evenly during re-entry. That is what ablative shields do. They absorb heat by burning away in a controlled, predictable fashion, layer by layer, like a candle melting from the outside in. Orion's shield had not done that. Instead, pieces of the outer char layer had cracked apart and blown off in chunks. Not small chips, fragments large enough that NASA's Office of Inspector General described them as creating a trail of debris behind the spacecraft. Engineers found damage in over 100 locations across the shield's surface. If there had been astronauts inside, they probably would have survived. Probably. The capsule's inner structure held, temperatures inside stayed in the mid-70s, and the shield, despite looking like it had been attacked, did technically protect the vehicle. The word technically is doing a lot of work in that sentence. NASA launched an investigation, over 100 tests at facilities across the country. ArcJet testing at Ames Research Center in California, laser testing, hypersonic wind tunnel runs. Engineers pulled roughly 200 samples of Avcoat from the recovered shield and sent them to Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama for analysis. The investigation dragged on for nearly 2 years. In December 2024, they finally published the root cause. The Avcoat wasn't porous enough. During re-entry, the material heats up and undergoes a process called pyrolysis, essentially combustion without oxygen, which generates gas inside the shield. On a properly permeable heat shield, those gases seep outward through the charred outer layer and dissipate harmlessly. On Artemis I, they couldn't get out. The outer char layer sealed itself too tightly, trapping the gas underneath. Pressure built. Cracks formed. And when the capsule dipped back into the atmosphere for the second phase of its skip re-entry, those pressurized pockets detonated outward, popping chunks of the char layer off like blisters bursting on sunburned skin. The irony is that Apollo engineers had known about this exact problem half a century earlier. The original Avcoat formulation used on the Apollo command modules was designed with permeability in mind. Apollo capsules used skip re-entry trajectories and never had heat shield issues. The Artemis version of Avcoat was reformulated slightly, and nobody caught that the change had reduced its ability to breathe until pieces of the shield were floating in the Pacific Ocean. That discovery created a problem with no clean solution. NASA ordered a redesigned, more permeable heat shield for future Artemis missions, starting with Artemis III. The fix for Artemis II was another matter entirely. By the time the Artemis I capsule splashed down and engineers started cutting into its shield, the Artemis II heat shield was already built and bolted onto the spacecraft. Replacing it would mean years of additional delay to a program that was already behind schedule by half a decade. The Artemis II shield was actually less permeable than the one that had failed on Artemis I, because NASA had deliberately made it denser to test the bonding strength between the shield and Orion's hull. So they made a decision: fly it as is. The logic went like this. The damage on Artemis I was caused specifically by the skip reentry profile, the technique where the capsule dips into the atmosphere, bounces back up, and then plunges in again. During that bounce, the outer char layer cooled and sealed, while the inner layers stayed scorching hot, trapping gas with nowhere to go. If they changed the re-entry trajectory to keep the heat shield under continuous high temperature throughout the descent, the outer char layer would stay permeable and the gas would vent normally. Instead of skipping like a stone across water, Artemis II would take a steeper, more direct path, a loft instead of a skip. Come in fast, come in hot, and don't give the shield time to seal itself shut. Former astronaut Charles Kamada publicly disagreed. Kamada, a heat shield expert who had been part of the first shuttle crew to fly after the Columbia disaster, estimated the probability of catastrophic failure at 1 in 20, a 95% chance of success. That sounds reassuring, until you remember that NASA's own safety threshold for crew loss during re-entry is supposed to be roughly 1 in 500. Kamada compared the analytical tools NASA used to evaluate the shield to the same institutional failures that led to Challenger and Columbia. He said the agency had not fully modeled how cracks could propagate under the modified trajectory, and that the decision to fly was driven by schedule pressure rather than engineering certainty. The ghost that hung over the entire discussion, the one nobody at NASA wanted to invoke, but everyone was thinking about, was Columbia. On February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry when superheated air penetrated a breach in its thermal protection system, caused by a piece of foam insulation that had struck the wing during launch 16 days earlier. All 7 crew members died. The foam strike had been observed on launch cameras. Engineers at NASA had flagged it. Management had declined to investigate further, reasoning that foam strikes had occurred on previous flights without catastrophic consequences. The institutional logic that killed those 7 astronauts was that the system had worked before, so it would probably work again. 23 years later, NASA was asking the Artemis II crew to trust a heat shield that had visibly failed on its only previous flight. The parallels were uncomfortable enough that Kamada invoked Columbia by name in his public criticism. NASA pushed back. Engineers ran worst-case simulations where entire blocks of Avcoat were stripped away during descent and found that Orion's underlying composite structure, reinforced with titanium, could survive even that scenario. An independent review team examined all the test data and agreed with NASA's conclusions. Commander Reid Wiseman told reporters he had sat in the engineering meetings, walked through the data himself, and was satisfied. "If we stick to the new re-entry path that NASA has planned," he said, "then this heat shield will be safe to fly." On April 1, 2026, at 6:35 in the evening, NASA's Space Launch System rocket lifted off from Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center, carrying the 4 astronauts on the first crewed flight to the Moon since Apollo 17 in December 1972. 53 years. more than half a century since any human being had left low Earth orbit. The rocket worked. The spacecraft worked. The translunar injection burn, a 6-minute firing of Orion's main engine, pushed the crew out of Earth orbit and onto a trajectory toward the Moon. For the next several days, the crew tested Orion's systems in deep space, checked life support, ran navigation procedures, practiced manual piloting, and ate rehydrated macaroni and cheese from pouches. On April 6th, they flew around the Moon. They set a new record for the farthest distance any human had ever traveled from Earth, 252,760 miles, surpassing Apollo 13 by over 4,000 miles. They witnessed a solar eclipse from behind the Moon that Glover would later call the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They named a crater after Wiseman's late wife, Carol, in a moment that made the entire crew cry on live television. They spent a week and a half testing every system on a spacecraft that had never carried people before, and by all accounts, Orion performed beautifully. None of that mattered if they couldn't get home. On the evening of April 10th, the crew of Artemis II was falling toward the atmosphere. At 7:33 in the evening, Eastern Time, the crew module separated from the European-built service module. The service module, which had powered Orion for the entire journey, would burn up over the Pacific. It was no longer needed. Orion was on its own. An 18-second burn from Orion's thrusters aligned the heat shield with the planet below. Everything that mattered now was geometry. The angle of attack had to be precise. Too steep, and the capsule would decelerate too violently, subjecting the crew to forces that could cause blackouts or worse. Too shallow, and it would skip off the atmosphere like a rock off a lake and sail back into the void with no way to return. At 7:53, Orion crossed 400,000 feet. Entry interface. The capsule was traveling at nearly 35 times the speed of sound, roughly 24,661 miles per hour, about 130 miles per hour short of the all-time record set by Apollo 10 in 1969. The atmosphere, thin as a whisper at that altitude, began to bite. Within seconds, the air molecules piling up against the heat shield compressed and superheated into plasma. The capsule vanished inside a sheath of ionized gas, glowing at nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, half the temperature of the surface of the Sun. Through the windows, the crew watched the world turn to fire. If you have ever seen re-entry footage, you know what this looks like from the outside. A streak of white and orange light arcing across the sky like a slow-motion meteor. From the inside, it looks like the windows are melting. At 1 minute and 22 seconds after entry interface, the shield hit peak heating. This was the moment. The Avcoat was supposed to be charring evenly, shedding heat layer by layer, its gases venting outward through a permeable outer crust. If it wasn't, if the char layer was sealing, if pressure pockets were forming the way they had on Artemis I, there was absolutely nothing the crew could do about it. There is no escape system during re-entry, no abort, no eject button, no backup shield. NASA builds redundancy into nearly everything it flies, not the heat shield. It either works or it doesn't. And the crew couldn't even tell mission control what they were seeing. The plasma surrounding the capsule was not just hot, it was electrically charged, and it blocked radio signals the same way a wall of static drowns out a conversation. Communications went dead. A planned blackout, yes. Expected, yes. Accounted for in every simulation. That does not make it less terrifying when it is happening to you. For 6 minutes, Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen were the loneliest people in the solar system, falling through fire at 4 times the force of gravity, with no one on the ground able to hear them, see their telemetry, or help them if something went wrong. At Mission Control in Houston, Flight Director Jeff Radigan and his team sat in silence. Radigan had described it beforehand with the kind of understatement that astronauts and flight controllers specialize in. We'll just be thinking through things to keep ourselves calm as we wait for reacquisition of signal. Think about what that means. A room full of the most capable aerospace engineers on the planet, people who have spent years training for this exact moment, staring at screens that show nothing, listening to speakers that play nothing, knowing that 4 of their colleagues are inside a burning capsule with a known defective shield, and that the next voice they hear will either confirm that everything worked or that it didn't. And there is no third option. 6 minutes of that. The crew felt 3.9 Gs during peak deceleration, nearly 4 times their body weight pressing them into their seats. Breathing becomes deliberate at that level. You have to consciously squeeze air into your lungs against the force trying to flatten your chest. Your vision narrows. Your arms weigh 40 pounds each. If something goes wrong with the capsule's orientation and it starts tumbling, you physically cannot reach the controls. The capsule itself is shaking, not gently. The entire vehicle is vibrating as superheated air batters it from every direction. Through the windows, if you can turn your head far enough to look, you see nothing but orange and white plasma. No stars, no Earth, no sky, just fire. Retired astronaut Butch Wilmore, who has experienced re-entry on previous missions, described the blackout as the loneliest feeling in spaceflight. "You know the blackout's coming," he said, "but knowing doesn't help. You are still inside a burning machine with no radio and no options, counting the seconds until the plasma clears and the signal comes back." Then, just before 8 o'clock, a voice crackled through the static. "Houston, integrity, we have you loud and clear." Reid Wiseman, calm, steady, as if he just walked in from checking the mail. The shield held. The modified trajectory worked. The continuous heating kept the Avcoat permeable. The gases vented, and the char layer eroded the way it was supposed to, slowly and predictably, without cracking, without fracturing, without blowing chunks of itself into the hypersonic slipstream. 2.5 years of engineering analysis and 100 tests across the country had produced the right answer. Kamada's 1 in 20 scenario did not materialize. The bet paid off. What followed happened fast. At 22,000 feet, 2 drogue parachutes deployed, yanking Orion's speed from thousands of miles per hour down to about 307. A minute later, at 6,000 feet, 3 massive main parachutes billowed open, each one the size of a football field, hauling the capsule down to a gentle 17 miles per hour. At 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time, Orion hit the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego with what NASA's commentator called a perfect bullseye splashdown. The entire re-entry, from entry interface to splashdown, lasted 13 minutes. The blackout was 6 of those. The peak heating phase, the 4 minutes when the shield was under maximum stress and the crew was completely alone, is what the mission will be remembered for long after the engineering reports are archived and the press conferences are forgotten. Because the thing nobody talks about enough is what those 4 people carried into that capsule with them. Not just the flight data and the checklists and the procedures rehearsed 1,000 times. They carried something heavier than all of that. Reid Wiseman carried 2 daughters who had already lost their mother. He had posted a selfie with Katie and Ellie before launch and written, "I love these 2 ladies, and I'm boarding that rocket a very proud father." 6 years earlier, his wife Carol had been diagnosed with cancer. She told him not to quit NASA, not to move the family closer to their relatives back east. She said, "This is where you work and you love your job. We should not give that up for this." She died in May 2020 at 46. He raised the girls alone, trained for the most dangerous mission in a generation, and then sat inside a burning capsule with no way to call home for 6 minutes, knowing that if the math was wrong, those girls would lose their remaining parent too. 4 days earlier, floating 252,000 miles from Earth, farther than any human had ever traveled, the crew had looked through Orion's windows at craters no human eyes had ever seen. Jeremy Hansen, voice cracking, told Houston that the crew wanted to name one of them Carol. A bright spot on the moon, he called it, visible from Earth at certain times of the lunar cycle. The crew wrapped their arms around each other and floated in silence while Mission Control said nothing for 45 seconds. Victor Glover, the mission's pilot and the first black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit, called the solar eclipse they witnessed from behind the moon one of the greatest gifts of the mission. Christina Koch, who already held the record for the longest continuous spaceflight by a woman, described the far side of the moon as something that defied the simulations they had studied for years. And Hansen, the Canadian Air Force colonel who became the first non-American to fly beyond low Earth orbit, used the distance record moment to issue a challenge. We choose this moment to challenge this generation and the next to make sure this record is not long-lived. They came back through fire with a heat shield that everyone agreed was imperfect. Some called it safe enough, some called it reckless. The crew called their spacecraft Integrity and flew it anyway. When the parachutes opened and the capsule drifted toward the Pacific under 3 enormous canopies, the ISS crew watched from orbit, and astronaut Jessica Meir shared a photograph of the reentry trail streaking across the atmosphere below them. Recovery teams from the USS John P. Murtha pulled alongside the bobbing capsule in inflatable boats. Ocean currents slowed the setup of the inflatable raft they call the front porch, the platform that would serve as a bridge between the capsule and the helicopters waiting to carry the crew to the ship. Divers entered the capsule to check on the astronauts and run initial medical evaluations. All 4 were in good shape. The undersea medical officer confirmed it. One by one, the astronauts climbed out of the hatch they had last used 10 days and nearly 700,000 miles ago. Wiseman came out last, stepped onto the raft, and looked up at a sky he had been falling through minutes earlier. Nikki Fox, NASA's Associate Administrator for Science, called the re-entry picture perfect. The commentator Rob Navias, who had been narrating NASA missions for decades, and finally let it go. This is a perfect descent for Integrity, its crew sounding hale and hearty on board. NASA will inspect the Artemis II heat shield in the coming weeks. They will compare the char patterns to their models, measure the erosion, and determine whether the modified trajectory performed as predicted or whether they got lucky. For Artemis III, a redesigned shield with better permeability is already in production. The bet NASA made on Artemis II will not need to be made again. 13 minutes from atmosphere to ocean, 6 minutes of silence, 4 minutes of maximum heating where everything had to hold. And it did. 4 astronauts climbed into a capsule with a known flaw, trusted the engineers who said they understood it, and rode a controlled fireball to the surface of the Pacific Ocean at nearly 5 times the speed of a rifle bullet. We sent them to the moon because we could. We brought them home because the shield held. And somewhere on the near side of the lunar surface, there's a bright little crater that doesn't have an official name yet. The crew calls it Carol. If you know where to look, you can see it from your backyard during certain phases of the lunar cycle. A small, bright spot on the boundary between the side of the moon we know and the side we are only beginning to explore. That feels about right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.